The Jets have signed a number of players who are not household names in 2025, but these seemingly minor signings could have a major impact on the team this coming season. Let's figure out how all the pieces fit today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, March 18th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Well, on yesterday's show, we talked about some of the big name free agents the Jets have brought in this offseason. But most of the free agents the Jets have signed have been far smaller scale additions. And on today's show, I'd like to talk about how some of the minor signings could have a major impact on the 2025 New York Jets. And I'm going to begin by talking about a couple of guys the Jets have signed along the offensive line. Now, it's been kind of a nice offseason for the Jets on the offensive line because there really has not been a major overhaul needed. And that's new. If you follow the Jets the last decade plus, usually we're talking about replacing 3-4 starters on the offensive line each offseason. This year, the Jets really only have one spot they need to address, and that's the right tackle position because, unfortunately, Morgan Moses left the team. He signed a multi-year contract with the New England Patriots, and I can't really blame the Jets for letting Morgan Moses go. Now, I could blame the Jets 3 years ago for letting Morgan Moses go when he left for the Baltimore Ravens. But Moses is at an advanced stage of his career. He's 34 years old. He's shown signs of slowing down. His body started to show signs of breaking down. So I can't really blame the Jets for letting Moses leave to New England on a multi-year deal. However, the Jets do need to figure out a way to replace him. I don't think they've found an adequate way to do that yet, but I do think the team's made a couple of solid low-cost signings on the offensive line. They've actually brought in a player from New England, Chukwuma Okorafor, and they also signed Josh Myers from the Green Bay Packers, who's a center. Now, it's conceivable Okorafor it ends up being the starting right tackle for the Jets. It's also conceivable the Jets end up starting Myers at center. He's been the starter in Green Bay the last 3 years, and then slide Joe Tippmann out to right guard and then Elijah Vera Tucker out to right tackle. I don't think either of these is a great plan. I don't know that Okorafor is a player you really want to count on. He only played 12 snaps for New England last year, was benched and then left the team. And this comes after a season where he was benched in Pittsburgh. He was the starting right tackle for the Pittsburgh Steelers for about 3.5 years and then was benched for the rookie Broderick Jones. And a lot of that was due to Okorafor's bad, shaky play. Okorafor's been an okay starter in the past, but we're talking about 2 full years since that's been the case. I think as a bounce back candidate, he's not a bad bet. And I'd imagine, the Jets did not pay a whole lot to get him. So, I mean, at 27 years of age, he'll be 28 when the season starts. A guy with, multiple years, 60 starts under his belt, and has not been a disaster for most of his career. It's not a bad signing. I think the same is true of Josh Myers. I don't think anybody's going to say Josh Myers is an all-pro caliber center. I don't think anyone's going to say Josh Myers is a Pro Bowl caliber center, but he's a guy who's not a disaster. And what I think these guys provide is a floor for the Jets on the offensive line. Because, look, you want 5 guys who are great starters on the offensive line, but that's not realistic. A great offensive line, even like the best offensive line in the league, doesn't have 5 great players. Usually you have 5 players who work very well in tandem. And offensive line works as a unit. So sometimes you have a guy who's not that great, but who looks good because he's surrounded by a great supporting cast around him. But it's critical in the NFL to not have a disaster offensive line. It's ideal to have a great offensive line. It's ideal to win in the trenches because as much as we focus on playmakers and as much as we focus on the quarterback position and as much as we should focus on these things, football is still a game of physicality. Football is a game in many cases that's won and lost in the trenches. You want to have a great offensive line, but it's essential to not have a disaster offensive line. The difference between a great offensive line and an average offensive line is less than the difference between an average offensive line and a disaster offensive line. If you have an offensive line that at least has guys who aren't disasters, you'll be able to function. You at least have a chance to be able to function. If you have guys who are disasters playing on the offensive line, you have no chance. And like the Jets have seen this through the years. I mean, last year, the Jets' offensive line was not the problem. It may not have been a top 5 unit, but it was not for all the problems the Jets had on the offensive side of the ball last year, the offensive line is not what dragged them down for the most part. There have been years, however, where the Jets have had a disaster on the offensive line. If you're a fan, if you're a longtime fan, I'll go back 14 years when the Jets had Wayne Hunter starting at right tackle in 2011. That sunk that offense. You can go down the line. I mean, there have been years where the Jets just did not have quality depth because it's hard to get quality depth in the NFL. So look, I think the Jets still need to figure out something at the right tackle position. I don't think either of the options I laid out are particularly good options. I don't think Okorafor is a quality option to start at right tackle because look, he's been benched 2 straight seasons and he really didn't even play last year. He played 12 snaps before he left the Patriots and was benched. 2 years ago, he was benched by the Pittsburgh Steelers. It's one thing to say this guy's got 60 starts under his belt. He's got a track record of good play. We're getting him for the minimum. He's a depth guy. That's one thing. To say we're starting him, that's another. Josh Myers, again, a guy who shown he can at least be functional in the pivot at the center position. Does that mean I want him starting at center? Not particularly. Does that mean I want to move Joe Tippmann, who's looked really good at center, and then move Elijah Vera Tucker, who's been really good at right guard? Do I want to move two quality young players off positions where they've thrived to make room for Josh Myers? Not particularly. But if the Jets can figure out the right tackle position, these signings can really help the team because offensive line's a spot where you're probably going to suffer injuries. There are guys who are injury prone. I think being injury prone does exist. I think, studies have shown that players who are older are more susceptible to getting injured. Players who have a track record of getting injured in the past are more susceptible to getting injured. But there's a lot of randomness on the offensive line. You could have a guy who's very durable on the offensive line, and somebody just rolls on him the wrong way, and his ankle twist or his knee twist the wrong way, and you have a guy who's going to miss time. It's important to have at least adequate players on your second unit offensive line, and I think both of these guys at least give the Jets players who could be adequate guys in their backup offensive line, so that if the Jets suffer an injury, they're not going to put in a guy who's a total disaster up front. And that's not ideal, but it's about the best you could do for backups because there just aren't many teams that actually have quality backups on the offensive line. Anybody who's good in the NFL as an offensive lineman is usually starting. Offensive line depth, there may be a couple of teams that have it, but it's a real luxury in this league. So what you're really looking for are guys who can at least hold the fort, guys who can give you somewhat credible play, guys who at least won't sink your offense. And I think that both of these signings, they're under the radar signings. Okorafor got mocked because, first of all, it's the Jets. And whenever the Jets make a signing that's a bit outside the box, they get mocked just because so much has gone wrong for this franchise. But they also got mocked because this was a guy who was benched after 12 plays and then left his team. But I think it's actually a pretty decent play for the Jets when you consider how little they're going to be paying him and his track record and the potential upside for him to bounce back. He's only going to be 28 this season. Myers, a solid signing. The Jets did not pay a whole lot for him. He can help. He can probably man both all 3 of the interior offensive line spots as a backup and at least gives the Jets a fighting chance if there's an injury on the offensive line. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the defensive line. Jets have made a couple of signings there. I got to be honest, I'm not as optimistic on these signings. They do sign pivotal. They do entail pivotal roster spots, but I think there are real questions whether these guys can perform at the level the Jets need them to perform at. Maybe the coaching staff can do the job. We'll break all of this down in detail as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before because right now new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the nets. You may have your eye on a few underdogs this year, and FanDuel makes it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. With tournament games happening almost every day, there's always something exciting to bet on. The FanDuel app is simple to use. When you win, you get paid instantly, no waiting around. The March Madness begins tonight. The first 4 gets underway. And if you're a local college basketball fan, St. John's, I mean, they're looking really good. Big East champions. But look, you may have gone to school somewhere else. No matter where you went, FanDuel's the best place to get in on the tournament action. Just visit FanDuel.com and get in on college hoops all tournament long. Again, visit FanDuel.com to get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes through the week, each day, Monday through Friday. We're talking about some of the smaller scale moves the Jets have made in free agency. The Jets have not been super active in free agency this year. Their big moves have been Justin Fields at quarterback, then Brandon Stevens at corner, and Andre Sisco at safety. But teams kind of spread their money around. They've made a lot of like kind of small scale moves, and that's what we're looking at today. We're really kind of diving deep. In our first segment, we talked about the offensive line. Critical spot where the Jets haven't quite figured out the right tackle position, but I think they've added quality depth. And I know like every time like a team signs a veteran offensive lineman, you hear, oh, this is a depth move, but Jets actually have signed guys who have a track record of giving competent play as starters. So I think that the Jets have done a good job on the offensive line. We're going to turn our attention now to the defensive line. I got to be honest with you, I don't think the Jets have done quite as well here. I question a couple of the moves the Jets made. I don't think, I still think there's time to turn it around. I think there are a couple of caveats that I'll go into if you're looking for a glass half full perspective. But I'm not a huge fan of I'm going to be honest. I'm not a huge fan of what the Jets have done on the defensive line. So at the tackle position, they've signed a couple of guys. They agreed to terms with Derek Nandi of the Kansas City Chiefs. And then they've signed from the Cincinnati Bengals a defensive lineman, defensive tackle, Jay Tufel. And these are both kind of rotational guys. Now, I think with Derek Nandi, who signed from the Chiefs, people are going to point out that he played for the Chiefs, and this is always what happens. Is like whenever the Jets sign somebody from a team that's been really good, they talk about like how like he understands, he comes from a winning locker room, so he understands how to instill that. And in reality, most of the time when you get a guy like this who just happens to be tangential to the team's success, he doesn't really add a whole lot. Neither Nandi or Tufel are really particularly great players. These are both guys who've gotten a handful of snaps, but not really done a whole lot with them. Neither of them's a particularly great pass rusher. So, if you're looking for like the glass is half full perspective, here's what I've got. Number one, as always, as I discussed yesterday when I was talking about Brandon Stevens and Andre Sisco and Justin Fields, this is a new coaching staff. There's no track record. One of the things the good regimes do in the NFL is they find guys who are undervalued. They find guys who maybe did not produce at a high level on their former team, but there's reason to believe they'll perform better on a new team. Maybe they just have attributes that fit your system better than their old team system. Maybe there's some technical issue that the new coaching staff thinks they can fix. We don't know if that's the case with either of these guys, but maybe it's possible. You can't rule it out. Again, new regime in here, so maybe you hope that they're good at this stuff. So maybe that's a possibility. The bigger thing though is that the offseason is not necessarily finished here at the defensive tackle spot, because if you look across the NFL, there are certain spots where very tough to find a guy in free agency. You can't really find an impact receiver in free agency. Occasionally there's a guy who gets available, but for the most part, that's a spot you got to fill through the draft. You can't really find a franchise left tackle in free agency. Again, that's a spot you got to fill through the draft. Every now and then there's like a franchise edge rusher, but most of the time it's not. And when one hits the market, there's a huge bidding war. Tough to land one of those guys. But there are spots where you can find somebody in free agency, and defensive tackle is one of them. And, every year you get past the draft and there's some defensive tackle who's a good run stopper in his 30s who's available, and he signs for the league minimum. He's just kind of trying to extend his career. And run stopping is the type of skill set that ages well. Now, I don't think either of these guys the Jets signed are particularly good run stoppers. So maybe because I'm not a big fan of them, my glass half full case is Jets may sign some other guys who are actually better. And it's kind of been interesting to watch the evolution of the NFL, because about 20 years ago, a run-stopping defensive tackle was really a premium player, because you had the 3-4 defense was in vogue. And to run the 3-4, you have to begin with a guy who just eats space in the middle of the defensive line, because you're only playing three defensive linemen versus the standard four, which means the guys have to be bigger to be able to absorb as many blocks, because you have just, you're dealing with 5 offensive linemen, but now you only have 3 guys up front on the defensive side of the ball. So you got to have bigger guys to eat up more space, and that begins with like a guy you play right over the center, a big nose tackle. But the NFL's evolved, and we've become more and more of a passing league as time has moved forward. So defenses have evolved with that, and defenses now want guys. They want to play a 4-man defensive line, more importantly, they want all 4 guys to be able to get up the field. Sometimes you play a 3-man defensive line, and there's a guy standing up who's technically a linebacker, but he's really like a 4th defensive lineman. But all 4, in theory, right now, I think you want all 4 of your guys to be able to at least add something as a pass rusher. So like 20 years ago, if there was a run-stopping defensive tackle, if he was a really good prospect, he could go in the top 10 of the draft. I mean, Haloti Ngata, a guy, great defensive tackle with the Ravens, he was a top 10 pick back in the 2006 draft. You can look this stuff up. The league has changed, though, and because of the way things have gone, these guys are not as viewed as premium players anymore. These are guys who don't have a lot of value. So you can find quality defensive tackles in the draft, and then you can find quality defensive tackles late in free agency, but you can also find quality defensive tackles in the draft. And I've been talking up my guy who's my favorite pick for the Jets at 7 right now. And look, this could change. There's still about a month between now and the NFL draft. But Mason Graham out of Michigan, more than just a run stopper, he's a guy who just wins. And he had Mason Graham to this mix. I think you're going to be in pretty good shape on from the defensive tackle spot, because now you'll have two guys where you put Graham next to Quinnen Williams. Right now, I got to be honest with you, the guys the Jets signed, I don't know that they're big upgrades over Javon Kinlaw and Lecky Fatu and Solomon Thomas. I think that it's more of the same. I like some of what Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji have done. I am wait and see on a lot of what Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji have done. If you're asking me, like, John, what's the thing you dislike the most? I think it would be these defensive linemen the Jets have brought in. And they've also brought in some kind of journeyman edge rushers, Rashad Weaver, who's bounced around. He was with 3 different organizations last year. And then they also brought in Jamin Davis from Washington. Guys who, aren't really that dynamic as pass rushers. I mean, I think particularly Weaver is a guy who's not really going to be guaranteed a spot on the team. It's been surprising to see the Jets sign Weaver as early as they did in free agency. The Jets still have some work to do on up front, though. I mean, I think they have to find at least one other quality defensive tackle, and I think they need a 3rd defensive end. I mean, you've got Jermaine Johnson, who of course is coming off an injury, so a bit of a question mark. You have Will McDonald just coming off a really solid second season, but I still think you need that 3rd defensive end, and I don't think anybody the Jets have signed here really fits that bill. Now, I'll go now. The counter argument to this is something I've mentioned, where the Jets are going to a defense that's going to be less defensive line based and more secondary based, because you're going to have more blitzing. More blitzing means you maybe don't need as much talent up front, but it's still an important spot. The trenches are still critical. I don't think the Jets quite have what they need there yet, and maybe it'll be the draft, maybe it'll be player development, but I still think there's some work to do up front. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to guys who are more wild cards. There are players the Jets are kind of try and squeeze production out of, who maybe haven't been that productive in the past, but maybe there's reason to believe that the Jets can get more out of these guys than their previous team. We'll go into detail on that, continuing here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the Bracket Breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. We're talking about some of the under-the-radar players the Jets have signed this offseason. If we're being honest, most of the players the Jets have signed this offseason have been kind of under-the-radar guys. Jets have kind of stayed out of the big names portion of free agency. I mean, the biggest name the Jets signed was Justin Fields, who's kind of an upside play. And the other big money deals the Jets have given out have been for guys who aren't really household names, guys who, if you're a Jets fan, I couldn't blame you if you had never heard of them before. So it's really been kind of a low-key free agency, quite a contrast with what we've seen the last couple of years. Of course, 2 years ago, the Jets brought in Aaron Rodgers, who's one of the highest profile players in history. Last year, the Jets made a number of key acquisitions when you're talking about Hassan Reddick. That was in a trade, or signing Tyron Smith, or signing Mike Williams. And, in season, they traded for Devontae Adams. So much lower key. And you see the Jets try and kind of like find some upside plays. A guy who's like really intrigued me, I've talked about him a couple of times on the show, is Stone Smart, who was a tight end they signed from the Los Angeles Chargers, a guy the Chargers, after 3 seasons, let go. And Smart is an interesting prospect from the standpoint that he began his college career as a quarterback, and then late in his college career moved to wide receiver, and then he got to the NFL and he moved to tight end. So guy is new at running routes and even newer at the tight end position. Now he's going to turn 27 in October. And to be honest with you, a guy who's about to turn 27 would typically not intrigue me at all as a project, because 27 is kind of old for a guy who hasn't produced yet. And whenever I say this, people are like, well, 27 is not old. 27 is not old if you have a proven track record in the league. 27 is not old if you've shown you can play. If you're a high-end player, 27 is usually your prime. The thing is, though, if you haven't proven yourself yet, 27 is kind of old, because most players who are good in the league, who have any sort of career, have proven themselves before they turn 27. So if a guy's that age, I'm sure you're probably tired of hearing me say the number 27. So we'll just say, if a guy's that age, and he hasn't produced yet, I want there to be actually a really good reason and some sort of plausible explanation about why he could be on an upward trend. Now, look, Stone Smart's a guy who, the odds are very much against him working out. The odds are very much against any conversion prospect working out. We're talking about a guy moving from a quarterback to a pass catching role. But there's at least like a plausible scenario I see. It's not totally out of bounds to think like maybe there's some scenario where he could pan out. Jets also kind of made an upside play on a wide receiver, Tyler Johnson, who was signed from the Rams. To be honest with you, I liked Tyler Johnson when he was coming out many years ago. I thought he was an interesting prospect when he was a draftee. He played wide receiver in college out of the University of Minnesota. He ended up being a 5th-round pick of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Actually won a Super Bowl the first year, but was really a depth guy. Never produced all that much. He's 26, so he's another guy who's about to turn 27. I mean, I'm not sure he's going to be much more than a wide receiver 4, but maybe he can pan out. Maybe he can help you as a role player. And then the Jets made some signings that guys who might help them on special teams. One is a guy who I've declared my new favorite player, Kene Wangu, the guy who had that monster game against Seattle, then got injured. I was at that game against Seattle. He wasn't excited. Maybe a bias because I saw him in person, and it was one of the most exciting performances I've seen a player in a Jets uniform produce. It was only one game, but look, I'm a big fan of special teams play. I think special teams play does not get its due. In fact, let me throw something out there that might be a little controversial. Kansas City Chiefs owe their dynasty in no small part to special teams play. Now, I'm not saying that that's the number one reason. I'm not saying that special teams play is more important than Mahomes. I'm not saying special teams play is more important than Reed. I'm not even saying special teams play is more important than Chris Jones or Steve Spagnuolo. But they've had great special teams through the years. And you talk about the Chiefs' record in close games. A lot of it has to do with their excellent special teams. And, you go back to the last time the Jets were good, 2009, 2010. I mean, look at those playoff games the Jets won those 2 years. Every single game that the Jets won, the 4 playoff wins, they outperformed the competition in special teams in all of them. And they made a big special teams play in all of those games. So special teams matter. And look, this is a guy who had one big game. I mean, should I be declaring him the next great return man? No. Am I declaring him the next great return man? No. But I do think special teams matter. And I'll throw out one other name on special teams, a guy the Jets just signed, Chris Boyd, who's nominally listed as a cornerback, but he's a cornerback the way, Justin Hardy's a cornerback. Justin Hardy was a guy the Jets signed from the Saints back early in the Saleh era, and he really played. I mean, he wasn't really a corner. He was a core special teamer. Boyd's the guy the Jets got from the Houston Texans. He spent the last 2 years in Houston, and he was a core special teamer in Houston. He played pretty much across the board. He played on the coverage units for kickoffs and punts. He played on the return units. He even got some field goal block team experience. And look, I remember when Justin Hardy was here, and people were very nice about it, but people kind of jokingly mocked me for saying, like, I thought Justin Hardy was a good player. I did think Justin Hardy was a good player. I felt like he was kind of underappreciated. And I feel like guys who play special teams are viewed as lesser players. And look, these guys may not be the most dynamic players at their natural position. They may not be the most dynamic player on offense. They may not be the most dynamic player on defense. And people focus on those two sides of the ball, and not unfairly so. I mean, those are where the stars are made. But sometimes you need guys who are like no-namers on special teams, guys who are willing to do the dirty work, guys who are willing to take the jobs nobody else wants to do. And, maybe Chris Boyd can be that type of guy. I certainly can hope so for the Jets, a guy who will never get a ton of praise except from me if he plays well, because I love special teamers who play well. But maybe Chris Boyd's the type of guy who can make a quiet contribution to the New York Jets and, be the next in a long line of quality special team specialists for this team. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody. Send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we have our weekly mailbag scheduled. Can't wait to answer your questions. We'll talk then.